Now, there's been a steep rise in requests for sick notes, and it comes as the number of working-age adults no longer in employment hits 2.5 million as a result of long-term sickness. That's according to the Office of National Statistics, who say that the figures for those off work with illness have gone up by 500,000 since life before COVID. GPs say that they are being bullied into handing out sick notes, with mental health a constant source of illness. Well, I've got my panel still with me to discuss this. Are we becoming a nation of skivers?
It is such a myth that we're this nation of malingerers, and it's brought up by, I would say, lazy politicians. Every few years we say we're sick note Britain, when actually the statistics show that fraudulent sick notes are so low in the UK. But we have to think about what could be compacting this. At the moment, we've got millions of people on NHS waiting lists. We've just come out of COVID. Long COVID is affecting so many people. Of course there's going to be more people off sick because we're sicker at the moment, legitimately. And I refute the fact that you could say GPs are saying. I think maybe one or two GPs have said they've been handing out sick notes.
Well, that's plural GPs. We only need two of them to get it to be plural. Nunziata, in the 1980s, lots of people had bad backs, and that seems to have changed, and lots of people have mental illness. And this study done exclusively by LBC on GPs does seem to be showing that they are feeling intimidated to give out sick notes.
It does, and there were clear threats within that report. But I am obviously 110 years old, but in my lifetime, the number of people on disability and sickness benefits has gone up by well over 6 times. The population's gone up by 15%. There is a disparity. 4 in 10 are for mental health reasons. Now, are we having a mental health crisis? Quite possibly. Should we be tackling that? Most definitely. Is the real problem that we are a deeply unproductive country in global terms, and that we need to tackle these issues from beginning to end, not just sign people off, which doesn't ultimately, if it's for mental health, make them happier?
Is it that we are an unproductive society, or is it that we are poorer and sicker because we're gripped by this cost of living crisis? Nothing is affordable.
You're very welcome to look.
Everyone's stressed.
The OECD figures that our productivity per working hour comes in down at number 16 of the OECD list. We are below Finland, France, Germany, Iceland. We're really not doing well as a competitive nation. We're less than half of the Irish productivity per hour worked. Now, we can change that through attracting businesses that have higher yields, that we can work in a different way. What we are doing is getting this wrong to the detriment of the people and therefore our health.
I would agree that we're getting this wrong, but I think the framing of this conversation is one example of where we're getting it wrong, because people need supporting rather than penalising, and we're constantly trying to crack down on things rather than understand.
I disagree. I think people need incentivising to make their lives better, to make the most of what they can do and what they can have, and to want to strive for it. And I think we've got to a place where that is being lost.
And aren't people happier when they're working?
Of course, everyone
So actually mental health is improved by work.
I would never say that anybody in this society is choosing not to work. They've been put in a circumstance where they're unable to work, or work simply isn't paying.
Well, I think that's a very good point. I also think it's quite tempting for governments to encourage people to be on disability benefits rather than on out-of-work benefits, because it makes the figures look better. But that's another subject which we may discuss on another occasion. In some totally shocking news, parents are being encouraged, you won't believe it, to send their children to school. His Majesty's government today has launched a new campaign, Moments Matter, Attendance Counts, in a bid to tackle the high levels of absenteeism in schools. Over the last decade, the number of secondary school children persistently absent in England has doubled from, not quite doubled, it's gone up from 567,000 in 2010 to 894,444. That's a wonderfully precise official statistic in 2021. And if we look at the heights of COVID, it was perhaps reasonable to keep a child at home with a little bit of a sniffle. But now, some years on, it seems that 1 in 4 parents believe it's still right for their child to miss out on a vital part of his or her education, and are having to be reminded that a runny nose or a tickly throat does not always warrant time away from the classroom. Well, back to my panel. Amy, so we've got the adults who are claiming to be off sick, and we've got the children who don't want to go into school, but actually it's much more serious than that, because we know that that figure of 900,000 children are mainly going to be the children of the least well-off in society.
Yeah, well, exactly. So that's coming partly to understanding maybe why there's an increase. If we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, poverty is linked to school absenteeism. There's 4 million children in poverty in this country. So I think maybe those two things are connected. And I find it frustrating when people peddle this idea of lazy parents, and rather than look at maybe what circumstances have influenced that parent to be in that position. And also underplaying the role of COVID in children's mental health. Children were off school for 2 years of their life. 2 years of a child's life is proportionally way more significant than 2 years of our adult lives. And I think children aren't being supported through
I half agree with that and half don't, because I worry that the greatest effect was on the elderly and that children are quite adaptable.
Oh, I disagree.
The message given to parents for 2 years was that your child not going to school doesn't really matter. And now the message is that if you take your child out from school so you want to go on a slightly cheaper holiday a day earlier, we're going to fine you. And that actually the massive overreaction with COVID, the closing of the schools, has terrible long-term consequences that we are still affected by.
I think the COVID inquiry continues to cost an absolute fortune and ask all the wrong questions. And this is a fundamental question it should be asking. What are the long-term impacts on the next generation? And I think it has been a complete disaster. And it has changed not just the children's attitudes to should they be in school, but the parents' attitudes to should they make them get there. And actually, at the end of the day, it is a parent's responsibility. And you can try and get rid of that as much as you like, but it is not the state's responsibility or a teacher's responsibility to get your child through that school gate. And if that takes some discipline and that takes some actual parenting, then that is how it has got to be. And those families may well have problems and they may need support in that. But at the end of the day, it's got to be the children who come first, and that's got to come from their own parents.
I would absolutely agree, but I think it's the state's role to support parents rather than, again, penalise parents. And this story isn't really talking about those who maybe take a day off to get a cheaper holiday. This is about children who are away 10% of the time, which is remarkable.
And that figure we just saw of over 800,000, that is the equivalent to an entire secondary school year. 1 in 7 children must be missing school. That's quite extraordinary on a permanent basis.
So how do you get them to go back? I mean, saying if you've got a bit of a cold, go in, that's great, that's a step forward. But penalising parents isn't the way I'd be in favour of
fining parents quite clearly doesn't work. No. And as already said, this mainly does affect the worst off, and issuing fines that they can't afford to pay is clearly not going to be the answer. I think we have got to go back to a society where there is genuine parental responsibility for their children, and that schools are there to help support, but not to take over the role of a parent.
But equally, it can get to a point where the state is making it quite impossible to parent. I mean, if you are so... At the moment, I think a parent at the end, a typical family who's on benefits will have £8 disposable income after they've paid all their bills. These pushing down the boundaries of financially of what is possible and not supporting parents with skyrocketing energy bills, I think that we're making it more difficult for parents to just be able to be great parents when there's so much pressures, external pressures coming from elsewhere.
A financial issue, that there are plenty of people who have no money left at the end of the week and make damn sure their children get to school and are looked after.
On public television, Miss Rees-Mogg.